Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night. Thank you so much for downloading the Faith Life Podcast. I'm your host, Pastor Nathan, here with my co-host, Pastor Matt.
Hey, guys.
And we have an exciting and action-packed episode for you today, so we're going to jump right in. But first, before we get to that, as always, if you have not done so already, please take a minute, leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, or wherever you may have downloaded this. And if you're watching us on YouTube, hit like, hit subscribe, leave a comment below so we know you are here. And if you want to be a part of the conversation, don't forget you can email us at podcast@dfchurch.com. That's podcast@dfchurch.com. Now, Matt, like I said, and we talked about this last week, we've got an action-packed episode for you today. We have a very, very special guest. We are joined by best-selling author, screenwriter, and cultural commentator Andrew Klavan, whose new book, The Kingdom of Cain, dives headfirst into the darkness, murder, madness, and meaning, and comes out the other side with something surprising: joy. In this book, Klavan explores how art confronts evil, how truth can still be found in a cynical age, and how Christians can create beauty in the very places the world seems most broken.
I love that.
Andrew, it's a real pleasure to have you with us today. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing well. It's great to see you.
Great to see you as well. Why don't we start maybe a little bit of a background, a little bit about who you are, kind of where you come from, and then we'll dive right into the book itself.
Sure. I've been a novelist my whole life and a screenwriter for a while, and found that myself sort of speaking politically in such a way that it became almost impossible for me to work in Hollywood anymore. But weirdly at the same time, or providentially at the same time, my voice as a conservative political commentator began to be picked up in various ways through videos and other things that I was doing. And I ended up on the Daily Wire, starting the Daily Wire with Ben Shapiro and Jeremy Boring, and it just took off and became a big deal. And that's been it's been a joy. It's been an absolute pleasure on that ride. And as far as my personal journey, I grew up Jewish, and I won't call it a secular home. We followed some of the holiday traditions of Judaism, but there wasn't a house with God in it or where we ever talked about God. And so I was absolutely alienated from my home religion and spent most of my life as an agnostic. And then about the age of 45, I started to realize that I simply could not make sense of the world without God. Literally could not make sense of the things that I believed to be the truth without God. And after about 5 years of theism and prayer, I finally turned to God and realized he had entirely transformed my life, and stupidly asked the question, well, what can I do for you? And
I love that.
And he said, well, you really ought to get baptized. And I thought, what? So that began an absolutely new journey, which has in fact been one of the central joys of my life. So that's where I come from.
That's amazing. Now, you mentioned, I know we're going to dive into the book, but you mentioned, you're on the Daily Wire. You started that with Ben Shapiro, who is still very, Orthodox Jewish.
Yeah.
Do you guys have a lot of conversations? Do you ever try to get into a little bit of that background of your kind of secular Judaism and how it led you to Christ versus kind of where, because I know he's had interviews with like, William Lane Craig and people like that on his show where they've kind of talked through some of those Jewish elements. But is that something that comes up at work, or are you guys just kind of at a point where?
Yeah, we certainly we've discussed almost everything, Ben and I, and argued over almost everything. I like to tell the story when we were doing a joint show. We would have these, shows where everybody would sit together and discuss the news. And he always had this little bowl of kosher popcorn. And he said to his assistant, is this the kosher popcorn? And his assistant said, yes, it is. And then walked out of the room, and Ben started eating the popcorn, whereupon the assistant came running back in and said, no, wait, that's not the kosher popcorn. And I turned to Ben and I said, well, now that you're not a Jew anymore, would you like to hear about Jesus Christ?
That's hilarious.
It didn't get me anywhere, but he's a lovely guy, and I think that God has his hand on him, and I don't worry about him too much.
That's good.
That's great. Well, let's turn a little bit to the book. You were kind enough to send us an advance copy. I was able to read it, and for me, I absolutely loved it. It kind of so I come from a background where I ran movie theaters, in management for 10, 15 years. I'm a huge literature nerd. I love both of these concepts, and so this kind of scratched all the right parts of my brain. Starting with Dostoevsky and then going into Ed Gein and how it leads into Psycho, which leads into Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Like all of those components, I was like, yes, I'm here for it. I loved it. And you kind of talk about this, like you're writing this book as a Christian about, murder and darkness and evil. What led you to writing this book like now? What led you to this at this time?
Well, it was actually three strains of thought coming together. One is that I really feel that modern Christian fiction, I don't hate it, but I don't watch it either because I just feel it's very happy talk and bland. And I'm all in favor of family entertainment, but I would like to see some of the depth you used to get in things like Shakespeare and the Sistine Chapel and the kind of music of Bach, and that used to be the greatest art there was, maybe ever was. And so that was one thing. And then there was something that's happened to me my whole life, and especially after my conversion, which was people would write me letters because I'm a crime writer. I write mystery stories. I write thrillers, and people would write to me and say, you call yourself a Christian, and yet all you ever write about is murder and evil and bad guys and bad women and what's going on. And I would say, well, have you ever read the Bible? Because,
right.
I'm just saying, I'm not comparing myself, but just saying. And so but I've thought a lot about that. Why is that such a fascinating topic? Every great novel that Dostoevsky wrote was about a murder. Right. And then, the third thing is this, as my faith has deepened, and obviously you come into faith, you can't be deep in faith right away, but God leads you on and kind of reworks everything about you. I've begun to realize that, like, God is the core of reality, and even religious people sometimes treat him as an ancillary fact about reality. So you go to church, but the rest of the time, it's not that you become a drinker or anything like that, but you sort of have this God side, but you're not actually thinking about God all the time. And to me, I have found that God infuses everything,
right?
And therefore, almost anything you write about, any work of art that is honest, is going to speak of God, even if you're an atheist.
Right.
And so then I started to think about, the works that I loved and all the poetry that I loved and all the literature that I loved, and how it had in fact led me to Christ. It was more in some ways, or at least as much as the Bible itself. And, it was reading crime novels and Shakespeare. And, I write about this in my memoir that really sort of led me on that journey. And so I started to think, there are certain murders that occur again and again and again in works of art. Right. So you were talking about, Ed Gein, the Ed Gein murder, and how it turns up in Psycho. It's Silence of the Lambs, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and then the entire slasher genre, which is mostly junk, but it's not all junk. There's a couple of movies in there that are actually quite good.
Amen.
And then there's this famous murder, which everyone's forgotten, from the 1920s, Leopold and Loeb, which was called at the time the crime of the century, and just absolutely froze the headlines. I mean, it dominated the headlines for years, in fact. And that's become movie after movie after movie, famous plays, because it's about two kids who got together and decided that they were Nietzschean. There was no God, and therefore morality had to be rewritten by supermen, and supermen had the right to kill and commit the perfect crime. And of course, almost all criminals, they were caught instantaneously by the flat-foot Chicago cops, And so all of these things feed into art, and art, when it's real art, transforms these horrors, these murders, this evil, into a vision of what's happening to our society in relation to God, where our society is. James Joyce said that art is the conscience of our race. Right. And it actually gives you a picture of where our society is in relationship to God. And I started to find that so fascinating. I just thought, well, that's actually a story in itself, and a way of discussing what I do, but also a way of discussing some of the books and movies that I just have loved so much my whole life, and why they don't lead me into darkness. In fact, they have led me the other way.
That's great.
So how, because that's a really interesting, they don't lead me into darkness, actually lead me the other way. I've had conversations with people. I love the theater side of art.
Me too.
And I've had a lot of people talk to me about, well, how do you balance your love for theater and your faith? So like how would you suggest as Christians we can better engage with the darker side or more secular art without compromising our faith? Like how does that actually lead me towards God and towards Christ rather than away from him?
Well, I think that you have to recognize that art, this is one of the mistakes I think modern Christian artists make, but I think a lot of artists make this mistake. Art is not a sugar pill put around a message. It's not a way of delivering a message. Art is an actual experience. I mean, if you're a theater buff, you know this. You go to the theater and it can shake you for days. You know, I just went to a great production of Uncle Vanya. I was walking around with my eyeballs knocking together for days afterward, So it's an experience. So if I said to you, this dark thing happened to you and yet it strengthened your faith, you wouldn't be surprised at all. And yet to explore that darkness and understand it in a way that is not harmful, where nobody actually gets killed, the actors get up and go home at the end, the novel is made up in a guy's mind. To explore that in that way actually prepares you for that experience and deepens your relationship to life. I mean, how many times, you guys are pastors, I'm sure you've heard people say, I've lost my faith because something bad happened to me.
Right.
And my first question, not to belittle that pain at all, but my first question is, well, why didn't you lose your faith when something bad happened to somebody else? Because something bad is happening to somebody else all the time. So to journey into that darkness, into that experience, the experience of fear, the experience of grief, the experience of danger and evil, really the experience of evil, and to say to yourself, well, wait a minute, this is so good. Because some of the stuff is trash and it really can be laughed off. But the stuff that's really good, if it's that good, if it's that real, if it's that true to life, what is it saying to me about God, about the world? And I think that if you relate to art as an experience, it starts to become clear. If I can just, not to run on forever, but just to give one example that is really important to me because it's been so moving to me, the play Macbeth, which is Shakespeare's story of absolute evil, murder, destroying your way to get to the throne, ends with one of the greatest speeches about nihilism there ever is, that life means nothing. It's a tale told by an idiot, signifying nothing, right? And if you look at that and think, well, that's terrible. How can I listen to this beautifully written nihilist speech? Or if you say, well, what has happened to Macbeth to make him feel that way? And what's happened is he's detached himself from the moral order. And if you read the play carefully, you'll see that they actually reverse creation in the play. Instead of pulling Eve out of the body of a man, the woman pulls her femininity out of herself and becomes this murderous accomplice. It's a brilliant, obviously, Shakespeare is kind of a good writer and it's a brilliant play. But when you relate to it like that, as opposed to like, oh, I'm hearing this thing that's going to pollute my pretty little mind.
Right.
Then you start to realize, oh, like any experience, it can enlighten you.
Yeah.
It kind of makes me think, and I wonder if some of the issue is, because I've had the same conversation over and over with people, and it's almost like there's a lost sense of media literacy, I'd want to say, whereas people are just so preoccupied, especially in the church, but anywhere, with the surface level details that they're missing the purpose of what it's trying to say. An example I always go to is a really, one of my favorite movies. This is it's maybe a cliched answer, I don't know. But I look at a movie like Pulp Fiction. Pulp Fiction is a phenomenal movie. Now, on the surface, yes, there's a lot of violence and language and all this stuff. But if you look at what it's actually trying to say, the entire movie is about redemption, right? This entire movie is about different people getting what they don't deserve in a lot of ways. And I mean, he literally, the Samuel L. Jackson character at the end of it, has this epiphany where he believes that God intervened in his life to save him from a life of crime to pursue something better. Like that's kind of the central message of that movie. And when I look at that, I'm like, that's amazing. But so many people get caught up on the violence or the evil or the negativity, missing out what it's really trying to say. And I think that happens in all art.
It's a delicate thing because, for instance, I think one of the greatest pieces of art in the last 30 years or so is The Sopranos,
Right.
and it's filled. I mean, almost every word you have to, when they show it's hilarious when they show it on cable and they have to bleep out the words because you can't really figure out what the guy is saying, and the nudity and
right.
And my feeling about this is, look, if that upsets you so much, there's plenty of art out there. You don't have to watch The Sopranos,
right?
But if you are more like you, where you're willing to take in this experience and understand that it's not your life, that is a show about people where Jesus Christ is clearly present in the show. I mean, I can cite the places where he appears. I was talking to Ross Douthat about this from the New York Times. He said, yes, this is true. And yet the people in the show can't see him. And because they can't see him, their lives never change. They never develop. They always do the same thing, go back to the same evil again and again. And it's a really powerful show. But again, there's plenty of great art out there. You don't have to watch it. One of the problems with the movies is the movies are a very literal art form. Mm-hmm. So when there's sex in a Shakespeare play, it's not nudity and it's not, so vividly done. And I understand that. I understand feeling, look, I don't want to look at that.
Right.
I know people I loved parts of Game of Thrones, but it was filled with exploitative sex. I mean, it was actually just HBO saying, in case you're bored, watch this. And a friend of mine said, I can't watch this because I get addicted to porn. And I said, if you get addicted to porn, do not watch the show because there are parts of it that are pornographic. But I don't have that problem. And so I could watch it. And there were times I was, I turned to my wife at one point and this woman was speaking and I said to her, put your shirt on. I can't hear the dialogue.
No, that's for sure.
But you don't want to degrade yourself and you don't want to go into places that you're not ready to go.
Absolutely.
But you shouldn't be afraid of the subject matter. That's the thing.
Right. And that's how I've always approached it is with people who are like, well, how can you watch XYZ? It's like, it's fine if that's not where you are, but to turn around and say that's nobody can be there gets, I think, a little bit dicey. And so it's good to be able to understand that as Christians, there is a little bit of, I know we don't like to think about this, but there's a little bit of that gray area where something might be more of a sin for one person than somebody else, depending on other factors going on in their life.
Yeah, I think that is absolutely true, and I think that somebody said that uncertainty is the price of wisdom, and I think that's true. That we do have different sins, we do have different things that are snares for us, and I have certainly read things that were so dark and so evil. I remember taking a book once and finishing it and thinking, I threw it out, and then I actually got out of bed, took it out of the garbage, and took it outside and threw it in the garbage because I just thought I do not want that thing around. But I think each of us kind of knows where those areas are and can avoid them.
Sorry, did you have one?
Well, I was you've mentioned kind of loosely a couple times Christian artists and the works that they're producing lately, at least, aren't quite as that. Let's just be blunt. They're not quality a lot of the times, right?
They're not.
And it gives Christian art a bad name. And so what would you say is like the responsibility of a Christian storyteller in dealing with some of these tougher subjects like murder or trauma or like psychological evil or things like that? What would be the responsibility as a Christian artist?
That's a great question. And just before I answer, just to add to what you said about, I think that Christian art not only lets art down, but it lets Christians down, because it's like if a woman watches romantic comedies, there's nothing wrong with romantic comedies, but if a woman watches them and thinks that's what romance is like, she's going to have a very hard time finding real love in her life. And it's the same thing with these Christian films. If you think that's what life is like when you have faith, your faith is going to leave you at the moment you face real life and real aggravation and grief. But I think the thing about a Christian artist, and I go back to Shakespeare again, there's a famous Shakespeare scholar who once wrote that Shakespeare is the most secular artist of his time. And I laughed out loud because I think Shakespeare is the most Christian artist of his time. And what Shakespeare did was he simply created the world as Christians know it to be, and then let people do in that world what people do. They kill each other, they betray each other, they love each other, they hate each other, they do all the things that people do, and he just created them more realistically than anybody else. And I think that's a Christian artist's responsibility, to not create a world that does not represent the world as it actually is.
Right.
And I think Woody Allen, who can sometimes be very funny and very talented, he's tried very, very hard to erase the Christian world. And sometimes it makes his movies kind of stupid. It's not like you just think that's not what would happen to people. And it makes, I mean, he's written 2 movies kind of refuting crime and punishment as I read them, and I talk about them in the Kingdom of Cain, where murderers get away with it and they feel fine, as if that means that Dostoevsky was wrong and there's no moral order. But in fact, somebody who commits a murder and feels fine is a psychopath, and there's a price you pay for that as well. Exactly. So he's not actually showing you life as it is. And that becomes a problem in his work. It becomes a problem in his work. So I think that, look, the responsibility of every artist is twofold: to see what is really there and to write what is really there, or to paint what is really there. And I think as a Christian, we have a faith that what is really there is more complicated than this flesh world that we see. There is an invisible moral order that is going on. Now, look, I've never seen an angel. I've never seen a demon. I believe in both, but they don't operate in, there's no guy with wings coming down, but I've had dreams that were biblical where it showed me what was going to happen next, and I'm not afraid to put that in a book. It's like, and in my mystery stories now, I'm writing a series of mystery stories, and the guy's not a believer, but he has believers around him. And so they tease him and he teases them. And there's a dialogue going on, but at least I'm not writing about a world. Like if you go to the movies, American movies, nobody ever says grace at dinner. Nobody ever prays. Nobody ever gets in trouble and prays, because they're actually on a mission to exterminate that idea. So I think that what Christian writers should do is include Christians in their stories, let them be real people, include the moral order in their stories, as you were talking about Pulp Fiction, which he very much does. And in that movie I liked even better, which is that one of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood.
Oh, yeah, that's great.
Yeah, I mean, talk about the moral order. That movie was full of it. And I think that's your responsibility, to write realistically, except that Christians, I think realism is a little bit bigger than other people do.
So as someone who, isn't potentially an artist, and a lot of our listeners are probably going to fall into a more conservative camp when it comes to these types of ideas. And, some would even be even self-described as more of a prude when it comes to some of this content, right? So how would you discern the difference between something that is real and shows what's real, right? Defines truth versus glorifying evil. Like where's that discernment?
Man, that's another excellent question, because I deal with it all the time in what I'm writing and all this. And one of the reasons I wrote the book is I tried very hard not to get gory or, abusive in describing the murders that I was talking about. I just wanted to show you how life becomes meaning in the words of an artist. But I think that, in some ways you have to feel your way. This really happened to me when I was working in Hollywood. I love ghost stories, and I was making a very good living selling ghost story scripts. And when that happens in Hollywood, they start to invite you in and ask you to write their story for them. So if they have a story that's a ghost story, they bring you in and say, what would you do with this idea we have? Unfortunately, in Hollywood, everything goes down to the lowest common denominator, because they're so desperate to hit the coarsest thing that will sell to the most number of people. And so I went in to hear the idea they wanted me to develop, and they said, we have this wonderful idea for you. And a ghost story to me is a very subtle thing. It's things that happen out of the corner of your eye. And I said, well, what's the idea? And they said, well, this woman gets kidnapped and tortured. And I went, yeah. And they said, that's the idea.
That's it. That's the whole thing.
I said to them, when a woman is running across the screen and a guy with a butcher knife is following her, I'm rooting for the woman. Yeah. And that was the end of the meeting. I was like, yeah, well, thank you very much. Don't let the door hit you on the way out.
That's funny.
And I think that is kind of, because you can't be too exact about it. You can only feel your way in some ways. But I know when I'm watching a movie, I know the minute the writer sat around and thought, how can I make this killing sexy and gory, and and how can I sexualize the violence? I know the minute it happens and he loses me immediately. When somebody dies, it's an actual tragedy. I mean, you've actually extinguished an entire inner world, at a time when it was not meant to be extinguished. That's a grave sin, and something of that depth, even in a thriller, something of that depth and something of that truth should be present. To the moral truth about the action should be present. When I talked about that book I threw away, it was exactly that. It was exactly the sense that he was actually not rooting for the same people I was rooting for.
He wants the killer to win.
And he was having so much fun in engaging in the evil that the evil sucked him in. And I've seen plenty of movies like that. And I'm very concerned about the fact that young men seem to love them. And when I've asked young men, why did you like that movie? I thought it was awful. They often say the same thing, because it made me feel something. And I think that if good artists are not honest, you can't make people feel something, and all they've got left is trash. Because trash will make you feel something, because it goes after your nerve endings,
Wow. Yeah, that makes sense. Going back to your book, as you started, we kind of rabbit trailed all over, which I love.
Sorry.
But at the beginning, you talked about the Nietzschean concept of defining your own morality and being able to step beyond what society says you should do because you know better. My mind immediately went, I started thinking, well, where else do I see that playing out in art, literature, things that I'm interested in? And as a big nerd, my mind went to superheroes, comic books. Like, it's this concept of a person who the law isn't doing what it needs to do, and so they can take it on themselves. Now, they might have a more defined sense of right and wrong than maybe Raskolnikov did in Crime and Punishment, but they still are determining on their own right versus wrong beyond what the law says. Is that something that you've ever thought about, that avenue of where these concepts kind of can take you?
Yeah, I have to say, it's not that I've never seen a good superhero movie, but as a genre that essentially took over the film business for 20 years, something like that, I thought it was actually infantilizing and a bad influence. And the reason, somebody would say, some younger guy once said to me, "Why are you so down on superhero movies?" And I said, because they have no sex and death in them. And what I meant by that is sex and death are really what life is all about. I mean, it's what we live with. It's the things that define where we're going. And superheroes, they don't really have a gender. They just have a shape, that the girls are shapely. And so we like to look at them, but they're just as strong as the men, and they're invulnerable. So you can't get out of those suits. So they're never pregnant. and so you feel that they're living in a world that has no consequences. And so when you talk about the moral order, it's okay for them to take the law into their own hands, because there's no reality in the story that is going to blow back on them, because the price that you pay for taking the law into your own hands is losing the law. And so they can discuss those things, but they can't really embody them. And so I really felt, when I listened to people who are like 40 years old arguing about a Spider-Man movie, I just think, at some point you should be arguing about something better than that. I loved comic books when I was 11,
yeah, for
12,
sure.
And then at 12, I started to notice there were girls, and I thought, the comic books, at some point you should grow up and kind of have more stories. That said, there are wonderful fantasy stories like Lord of the Rings that actually touch on real life and embody real life in fantasies. And there are a few superhero movies that do that, but not many.
I like that. The other thing, and now again, this is going to reveal my nerdy side a little bit. My mind went to video games and the way, as an art form, that some of these same concepts can be expressed, and it kind of tied in there. It made me think a little bit also of like Ayn Rand objectivism and this kind of selfish centrality. There was a game that came out maybe 20 years ago called BioShock, and it is very much. You've played BioShock. Perfect. So you know the kind of the Ayn Rand taken to the extreme, right? The character Andrew Ryan, who builds this city and everything collapses. To me, that is kind of a statement about if you the game starts off with him saying, the government wants your time and your money and they're not deserving of it. The church wants it. They're not deserving of it. The communists want it. They're not deserving of it. You're entitled to focus. It's that selfish ego first mentality. And he builds his city away just like an Atlas Shrugged, and it collapses and everything becomes a problem. And so to me, it's a kind of a critique of that concept that you can define everything yourself beyond what morality says. So that's
there's no question about it. And I mean, I think I love games, you know, so for a while I was a big video game player, and then I felt they kind of, plateaued and really, it's hard to find a good one now.
Sure.
But I think the thing about video games, I think they are mostly like the movies, a visual art form. Mm-hmm. And the excitement of them comes from the fact that playing them brings you into the picture,
right?
Which I thought worked really well in BioShock. There are a few games like that. So it's funny with video games. The story is only part of it. It really is that experience of entering the visual field.
Right.
But that was a good one. And that game Ico, I always thought was a classic. And nowadays I think most of the good games are kind of independent, weird little games like Braid and Inside. But I think it is. I've always found it an exciting way to tell a story, but it's really difficult to tell a good one. It's
pretty tough. Now I like you mentioned Ico. The second one made by that company, Shadow of the Colossus, was also a very moving and powerful. But again, it's that interactivity, and then you see things like, and this transcends the game medium. But recently, Last of Us. There's 2 games, and now it's HBO. Again, it's trying to tell this story of navigating morality in a society that collapsed. And I think, again, you kind of pull out all these same threads that you write about in your book of what does it look like if we reject God to try to have morality? And some people trying to give it one, and some people realizing that ultimately it'll descend into nihilism even. So,
well, it's interesting at the end of the Kingdom of Cain, the last 30 pages, mm-hmm. which I think is maybe the best thing I ever wrote. I'm really proud of it. Yeah. But it's funny because, first of all, it starts out being about the fact that I love this new technology.
I remember
this Oculus technology where you can enter 3-dimensional into the game. And so this is an imitation of that, since I haven't got the capacity to create that.
Right.
But it's a tour through a visual museum, the great works of art, and what happens when you lose God. And you can trace it's funny because there actually is a scientific theory about this, that modern art resembles schizophrenia. And I didn't actually know that theory when I was writing the chapter, but it does follow that. And it follows it mostly in the way we perceive the bodies of women, which of course are such an important bridge between, the spirit and the flesh, because they create human beings. And so, And as we see in our world, as we look at around, they are treated now just like, meat, essentially. And I kind of trace the way that happens when you lose God, and when you start with, the Sistine Chapel and you end up with like a blank page.
Right.
And I think that you're right, that there's something that happens. There's something that happens to the art itself when the artist loses God. I think he loses trust in his own perceptions, and his perceptions become illusions. And I think that this is what many, many, many of our intellectuals believe. They believe that our moral sense is an illusion. It's an evolved thing. It has to do with what we smell, and it's all but in fact, we're actually machines made to know, I shouldn't say machines, we're like sensors made to know right and wrong. We're made to, we can get it wrong, but we can also learn to get it right. And I think that morality is a real thing. It's actual something we see out there.
Right.
And we see it in human terms. We can't see it in God's terms, but we see it through a glass darkly. And I think that is something we lose when we start to convince ourselves that there's nothing there.
You mentioned that last chapter, and I agree. That was a phenomenal kind of step through. And there were multiple times when I stopped and looked up the things that you were referencing, because I was like, I'm not familiar with this work. The Madonna, I think it was Da Vinci out of the marble, Pieta.
Yeah. The Pieta. Yeah.
Pieta. There we go. I looked at that and I said, how could the fact that somebody could carve that out of marble blows my mind. Like, it's amazing. But your mention of the virtual reality, that would be a cool companion piece maybe to the book, where you create a virtual museum that somebody actually sees all that art and kind of flies through it as you described it. That'd be kind of cool. I don't know.
I would love it. I would love it if somebody could do that. Just take it's written as a script for that,
Oh,
basically.
My goodness.
And just a note on the Pietà, when Michelangelo signed the contract for it, the contract said it must be the most beautiful thing ever made in marble. And I thought, man, you got to have guts to sign a contract like this.
Seriously.
Because he signed it, and it was. It's still the most beautiful thing ever made in marble.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's good. Going back, I think this was more towards the beginning of the book. You defined evil as the absence of love. And one of the things that, as I was reading through that section, that came to my mind is how do you see that definition kind of shaping modern Christian responses to moral crises like abortion, terrorism, the decay of our culture? Like, how does that definition play into our daily Christian life in response to those?
Yeah, I mean, once you understand, I mean, I talk about the fact that any moral system has to be built on two ideas. One is that your inner life is just as important to you as my inner life is to me. And the second one is that both our inner lives are precious to God. And if you don't have that second one, then what do I care about your inner life? Why do I care how important it is to you? You have to understand that to know the value of something, to know its actual value, I have to actually cherish your inner life in some way that is like mine. To snuff that life out is in some way, I can't think of a worse sin, because it is the absence of that compassion, that connection, that love that is the center of the moral world. And what I believe, and what I believe Jesus is saying in the Gospels, is that is our natural self. That is who we are, and we get lost in an overlay. And I think that the cynical way of looking at things is, no, your virtue is an add-on. You're doing this because it makes you feel good, or you're doing it because it gets you social points or whatever. And I think, no, I think it's the other way around. I think that the fraud that we tell ourselves is that we want money, and we want fame, and I think those are the frauds in our life, the fakes in our life. And when we actually push that away, there's something much bigger and richer underneath that. And it's when we lose sight of that we start to become evil. I mean, that's when we start to say, like, you have money, I want your money, I'm killing you for your money.
Right.
That's when that logic makes perfect sense.
Yeah. Well, you kind of talk about that also in the book, about becoming who we truly are through Christ and creativity. So in reading the Kingdom of Cain, like, what is your hope, or how does it help readers kind of begin that journey? Like, what's kind of your hope with that?
Well, the second half of the book, the first half is kind of going through these murders and how they show up in movies and novels and all this stuff. But the second half of the book is more personal, and it's experiences that I have had from therapeutic experiences, ritualistic experiences, and artistic experiences that have helped me remain creative, which I think is the point. To remain, have a creative life in the midst of a world that I find very dark. I find the world is very dark. I mean, when people sit around and talk about, abortion being a human right, you sort of go like, I'm sorry, what did you just say? Like it's like you don't even know who you're talking to, and yet perfectly reasonable, perfectly nice people say these things. And so you realize, I'm in enemy territory, as C.S. Lewis said. I'm not in heaven here. And yet this is the place, when I'm calling the Kingdom of Cain, this is the place where you're supposed to rejoice. So how do you do that? How do you remain in that creative relationship? Because I think all of us, and I don't mean this this can sound kind of silly, but I think all of us are actual artists, in the sense that the reality that we live is made inside us. It is a collaboration with the created world, right? I mean, as we don't see it face to face. We don't see reality face to face here and now. What we see is the human reality, and that is a creation. And so how do you create that so that it's beautiful, even knowing that you're living in this world of murder and evil? And so that's what the second half of the book is about. The second half of the book isn't really about murder at all. It's about things that have affected me and have made me see the beauty of the world. And the reason the Pietà is such an important work in the story is it's in uncanny beauty, made out of the saddest moment in human history, which is Mary cradling her dead son in her arms. That's what the statue is. And you look at it and think, oh my God, this is beautiful. And you think, well, wait, it's beautiful. And yet it's the saddest thing that can happen, a mother losing her child. And it's the worst thing that can happen, a world losing its God. and he made beauty out of it. And my question at the end of the book is, well, if a man can make that moment beautiful, what can God make of this world that's so full of darkness? And I think that that's what artists are trying to get at when they write stories about murder. Great artists, when they write stories about murder and evil, they're trying to see a little glimpse of what God is going to do that is so beautiful in this world that we can't see now and that we should rejoice in even now.
That's good. One of the things we do on this podcast, it's the Faith Life podcast. So we bridge kind of how our faith interacts with our daily life. And so I love that this book writes about living joyfully in a world full of darkness.
Right.
How do you personally practice that kind of joy without falling into despair or even denial?
Yeah, no, I think it's really important. And luckily writers, being a novelist can drive you insane because you're always like opening up wounds that other people allow to heal over, because you want to keep in touch with all that stuff. And so I've developed a lot of practices that keep me from doing that, because I don't want to be an insane writer. I want to be a terrific writer, but I don't want to be a crazy writer or a destructive writer. And I think that first and foremost in my life, the appreciation of beauty anywhere that it appears, is really important, to not walk past the beauty of life, because the beauty of life hints at a beautiful pattern beyond life, I think. And I think that we walk around, we're so cut off. And I see mothers with their babies. And to me, motherhood is kind of the central act of humanity. And I see mothers with their babies looking at their phones, and I just want to go up to them. You don't want to be a pain in the neck, but you want to say, maybe you should be talking to the kid or looking at the kid or just appreciating what you are creating even in this moment. And I think all of society, all of the world tries to keep us from that. And so I do that. My prayer life I put a lot of time into my prayer life because my conversations with God are incredibly illuminating. I find out things that I couldn't have found out myself. And I always recommend to people that they spend, whenever people say, how can I feel closer to God? I always think, close the door, go away somewhere and talk to God out loud. Because when you talk out loud, your brain doesn't you don't get a lot of ellipses and your sentences don't trail off. You finish your sentences, so you finish the things you want to say. And you can hear how fake you are, how wrong you are. It's just very clear. And if it's not clear, God will show you what it is. And so that's really important to me. And in my youth, when I was really troubled, troubled to the point of suicidal, I was fortunate enough, and I write about this both in my memoir, but also in this book, that I did go into therapy, which I think that a lot of therapy, the book deals with psychiatry a lot because I talk about the psychiatrist character going from being a hero to being Hannibal Lecter to being evil,
Right.
But really psychiatry, which thinks it's a science, is really a practice of love. And what's really funny is I once said that to Jordan Peterson. And I said, psychiatrists think that their theories matter, but their theories don't matter. All that really matters is the relationship between the therapist. And he said, in a voice that everybody but me can imitate,
Sure.
he said, oh, every good therapist knows that. And I said, well, there must not be that many good therapists, because I know a lot of therapists.
Oh, that's great.
I think that is to enter into a therapeutic relationship of love can be very, very healthy and revealing, and get rid of some of the brain stuff, the psychological stuff that keeps you away from God. It won't give you the theological stuff that brings you closer to God, but it'll get rid of that stuff that's blocking you because your dad was mean or because your mom wasn't there or whatever it is that traumatized you,
I like that.
That's good.
So with this book, another question it's called The Kingdom of Cain, and Cain kind of features as that prominent biblical starting point of it. What made you settle on Cain as opposed to, any other biblical character to kind of centralize the concepts around?
Well, because I was writing about famous murders, the first murder is probably the most famous murder, and also sets the pattern of post-lapsarian life. It sets the pattern of what our lives are like in the world outside of Eden. And I trace it, instead of with the other murders, I trace them in works of art But since Cain really is involved in every work of art because he's the pattern of our fallen life, I trace him through the Bible, and I trace him through the Old Testament, especially, where every single story is a brother battle and a challenge between two brothers. I mean, it happens again and again. And I talk about the themes that brings up and why those themes ultimately lead us to the need for Christ as a redeemer and a need to what's the doorway out of this continual repetition of harm that we do to one another. And I really do believe it's the cross. I think that's what it is. It's a doorway out of history. And so that's why, I wanted to call the book Murder in the Imagination, but my publisher said that wasn't cool enough. And I said, well, it's all about Cain, so let's call it The Kingdom of Cain. And I think that's that really actually is a better title.
That's good.
I love that.
I think I just have maybe one more question, potentially to get people to pick up this book and read it. 'Cause I know I've been in this situation in the past in my life, especially earlier on in my faith journey, where I was hesitant to read about dark topics. So what would you say to someone like that to encourage them to read this book particularly?
Yeah, I think that when I was talking before about an artist's intention, you will see very, very early on, maybe in the first paragraph, that my intention is not a dark one. Right. And there are moments when I have to talk about things in a murder, but it does not revel in murder at all. It actually revels in art and in beauty and the ways that beauty comes out of evil. So it's not something I think that's going to make you feel like, oh my God, I've just smeared myself and I've been slimed. I just smeared myself in blood. It's instead going to make you think like, well, yeah, there is a lot of this in the world. I see it in the world. I can't turn away from it. This is the world. As one of my characters said in one of my novels, if you want to believe in God, you have to believe in a God of the sad world, because this is a sad world. We know it is. We see it is. And so I actually think it will strengthen your faith, I hope, in times when you confront these things. Because those are the moments. Those are the core moments. Because if you can walk through grief and suffering and keep your faith as a kind of star, well, I'm going through this tough patch, but that's where I want to get to. Right. You come out of it, and I've had this experience, I'm sure most people have at some point. You come out of it so much deeper and richer. Your faith comes out so much deeper and richer. And so this is kind of a guide to how to prepare for that and how to do that and how to be the person who can do that. And so I worry about people not wanting to read it because of what you said, but I don't worry about anybody reading it and finding it that way, right? Because it's very clear very early on that that's not where I'm going.
Yeah, I love the way that you do intertwine or reveal the connection of joy, murder, art, kind of all of it. I think you even open up in the first, the introductory section about how those three are intimately connected. And I think at a minimum, you hear that and it's like, oh, I'm curious now to see where you're going to take this. I've never heard that before. So now I want to know more. So, I didn't get to finish the whole thing, prior to talking to you this morning. So I'm excited to actually go through and finish it to see how it ends, especially some of the teasers that I got from the two of you guys today. But
absolutely. Where can people pick this up, and when is it going to be available for the general people to partake?
Yeah, we're talking on May 1st. It's available May 6th, but you can pre-order it on Amazon. And if you want to get it, I hope you will pre-order it, because that actually helps the sales of the book, because they all count them at the, it's boring, but that helps the sale of the book ultimately. But you can get it right now on Amazon, and that is really helpful.
Okay. We'll put a link in the description.
Yeah, I'll put a link in the description of this podcast, as well as social media. Are there specific places you like best to connect with people who want to learn more, follow you, kind of get a daily dose?
Yeah, usually the one social media I use is X, so I'm on there once a day. I have a Substack about faith that I write with my son called thenewjerusalem.substack.com, and those are the places where I kind of operate daily. And of course, I'm on the Daily Wire, where I do my show, which is political, but it actually does get into a lot of faith matters in the political world.
That's great.
That is great. Well, I think that is going to be all the time we have for you today, but I want to thank you, the viewer, the listener, whoever you are. Thank you for spending this last hour or so with us. Thank you, Andrew Klavan, for joining us today. We're so excited for your new book coming out. And thank you, Matt, for being on with me as well. With that, we will see you next week.
Bye, guys.